Great. Well, welcome everybody. We are here for Vaughan Wilkins' dissertation defense. He's presenting on the topic of cultural captivity, the ecopsychology of collective trauma. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Craig Chalquist. I'm core faculty in East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And at this time, I would like to ask the other two members of the dissertation committee to introduce themselves, starting with Zain.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zain Kavit. I guess I was faculty at California State University East Bay for about 8 years in the philosophy of religion department, but recently, about a year ago, quit, and now I'm working in robotics. So I've gone deep into Vaughan's areas of captivity. But yeah, that's basically me.
I'm Gay Bradshaw, and I have a nonprofit called the Karula Center for Nonviolence. And we have a sanctuary here in Southern Oregon called the Tortoise and the Hare. And the gist of my work has been on trans-species psychology and trauma, animal trauma, non-human trauma, and its healing.
Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
And welcome to everybody else who is here for our ritual. So let me give you a very brief overview of how we will proceed, and then without further words, I will hand it over to our presenter. So we're going to hear from Vaughan first, and he's going to use his time to tell us about his work, the perspectives that inform it, what the work was, ways in which it changed him as he did the work. And then at that time, his committee will be invited to ask him some questions about that work. Once the committee has done that, then the rest of you will also have opportunities to ask questions while the committee adjourns, which in terms of Zoom means that we'll shut off our videos, we'll mute ourselves, and then we will have a conference call and discuss the presentation. After we do that, we will come back into this space and then announce our decision about our candidate here. So one last word on logistics. Those of you who are joining us, we'd appreciate it if you would stay muted until the Q&A part after the committee has a chance to ask questions. And also in terms of your video, just be mindful of your background and surroundings. And if any of you need to, if you have your video camera on and you need to get up and go somewhere, please turn it off. Because it's a little distracting to have everything suddenly in motion while you're presenting. So a little Zoom etiquette goes a long way. So with that, I am happy to hand this over to Vaughan.
Great. Thanks, Craig. Can you hear me all right?
Yep. Okay.
And have you got the record button going?
I do. Thank you.
All right. You're so welcome. All right, friends. Thanks so much for coming today. We're going to be talking about some cultural captivity, which is the ecopsychology of collective trauma. But before we begin, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, which is just a way of reminding us that we're on stolen land, and there are other people in the world that we need to be mindful of. And there are systems of oppression that as ecopsychologists, we need to take down. So just join me in listening here and acknowledging where you all might be in the world right now. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Ohlone people, on which I am presenting today. I think it's important to acknowledge the land because I often hear talk about indigenous peoples as if they are extinct or only exist in the past. And because the core work that we do in ecopsychology is connected to the struggle against systems of oppression like those that have dispossessed indigenous people of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination and the legacy of place. Thank you for joining me in that. Yeah, so this journey for me, began 13 years ago in the Bronx Zoo in New York City. I was surrounded by cages. And I had gone in to study models of cooperation amongst animals, but instead ended up learning about the impacts of captivity and its impacts on behavior, survival strategies, and ecological connections that all beings have with the earth. So I wanted to begin by reading you the foreword for my dissertation, because I feel like it's the way that I ground myself into this work every time I come back to it. It's early morning in New York City, maybe 7 a.m. A cold January quiet hangs over the Bronx as I make my way from the 5 trains platform to the gates of the zoo. I feel a relaxation in the emptiness of the streets, a reprieve brought on by the winter hibernation, as I imagine snooze buttons are being pressed and warm blankets are pulled up tight by people bargaining for just a few more minutes in bed. I cherish moments like these. I feel myself expand and take up more space. I look up and around more, taking in the world around me, a world that, at least for this brief window in time, feels less grating and less overwhelming. I sign the zoo, notice how welcomed I feel by the curated trees, managed soils, and the imprisoned creatures all around me. Perhaps they too share the quiet joy of an empty early morning before the field trips and tourists flood these paths with their cameras and screaming children. Or perhaps the kinship I feel towards these creatures is a shared knowing, a knowing that they, like me, had not been shaped by natural forces and co-evolved over millions of years to live in a cage. Their captivity was obvious, held hostage by not only the concrete walls and steel bars, but also an ample and effortless supply of food, healthcare, and reproductive mates. The toys provided to detract from boredom and the terrain built to mimic the shadow of a lost world served only to highlight how far these beings were removed from the place on this planet that had birthed them. The same place that they had evolved to participate with as an integral member, the place where they actually came from and belonged still. This is a simple observation, one that any of our young field-tripping children could make. If asked, where do tigers come from? No child would answer, from that concrete box in the Bronx. No, this was not where they belonged, that much was obvious. What about me? What about us? Where do we belong? Humans. Are we not animals? Did we not once have a place in this world, somewhere we belonged, far from the concrete walls of our cities and the invisible bars of our culture? Did we not evolve in relation to the natural world like every other living being on this planet? And therefore, were there not still ecosystems longing to have us participate with them in the ways our ancestors had co-evolved to do? Oh, how I love these cold, lonely morning walks through the empty zoo before it opens to the public. There is a certain relaxation, a safety, or maybe just a hint of sanity that comes with being able to see and lay a hand on the bars that hold a life captive and know with certainty that they are not imagined. Thank you for hearing that from me. So we're going to take you through some background. I'll share the significance, take you through the research questions and the methods I used. I'll take you through a brief chapter walkthrough because we don't have time for all of it. I'll offer up the main conclusions, some areas for future work, and then some brief gratitude. So humans, like all beings, are shaped by the world around us, and in that way, we in turn participate in shaping the world. In this way, we are inextricably linked to the Earth systems and all those other beings that share this biosphere with us. However, with the continued escalation of human-made impacts on the ecosystem, its dysregulation, species extinction, and climate change, it's becoming more and more apparent that the way we're shaping the world has become distorted, destructive, and is leading to ecological collapse. Yet despite this knowledge, things are only getting worse. Across species lines, captivity creates and perpetuates, as well as exacerbates, distortions and obstructions to the ecological relationships that crafted both bodies and minds over evolutionary time in both human and non-human animals. The result is a variety of psychological issues, self-harming behaviors, known as zookoses. What if modern techno-industrial societies' ecological and psychological issues were symptomatic of nature-disconnected lives, anti-ecological behaviors, manifesting as a collective pathology, a human form of zookosis, cultural captivity? In the mid-1990s, ecopsychology as a field began developing just such a concept of a cultural pathology, or a collective madness, infecting the modern world. As a reframe on sanity, so here, not a subfield of psychology, ecopsychology posited that what is typically considered a normative and healthy, insane psychological baseline was anything but. Instead, the way that many humans in the modern techno-industrial world live in relation to the living biosphere and all the other species that share this planet was identified as anti-ecological and thereby deeply maladaptive or even pathological. Ecological issues are exacerbated by psychological issues. Psychological issues are exacerbated by ecological issues, all of which deeply implicate us in the way that we live in relationship to everything else on this planet. Yet despite these early warnings from ecopsychologists, the inclusion of competing ideologies, differing agendas, and desires to participate more empirically with contemporary mainstream psychology saw ecopsychology become just another subfield of psychology, as opposed to the much needed reframe on sanity that it had set out to be. However, with new insights emerging from trans-species psychology and studies with animals in captivity, this dissertation seeks to reinvigorate the conversation around the collective pathology of modern techno-industrial society. Despite the inconvenience of the concept, humans are in fact animals. This dissertation originally set out to explore the commonalities between the collective pathology of human animals, the one identified by ecopsychology, with the collective pathology of non-human animals in captivity, one that's been called zoochosis. However, what emerged in this investigation was that both zoochosis and ecopsychology's collective pathology are both a collective form of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, manifesting as a result of both physical and psychological captivity. This form of trauma robs the individual of their ability to sensually engage the world around them and participate fully in the here and now. I suggest that a form of place-based sensory participation, which I'll go into later, is key to reclaiming our natural connections and overcoming this trauma. So why does this matter? I've broken the significance down into academic, social, and personal. Mainly I want to bring up that this dissertation largely participates as a work of ecopsychology, and thus that's like where a lot of my focus has been. And psychology has moved into a new wave where it's almost an adjunct to the thing it was trying to stop. As a reframe against modern positivistic psychology that held a conception of psyche that actually condoned the way we're living on this planet as healthy, ecopsychology said the way we're living on the planet has to stop, so it cannot be condoned as sane. And yet now, it instead works as a servant of this same issue, kind of implicit condemnation of the way we live. Ecotherapy, as a applied branch of ecopsychology, has ballooned out to mean almost anything at this point. Like if you are looking at a painting of a plant, but thinking happy thoughts, you're doing ecotherapy for some people. There are some forms of ecotherapy that are actually doing more harm than good. And this dissertation helps to identify them and helps clinicians and therapists and healers actually be more at choice in the activities and the agenda that they want to participate in. And furthermore, there's still this line between humans and animals. Not like the line between the elephant and other animals. Like the elephant is different than other animals. That's true, we could see that, right? And the dolphin is different than other animals. Sure, and the earthworm is different than other animals. But we've still got this thing where it's like humans are also different than other animals, but somehow all the other animals are the same when we compare them to the humans. There's humans here and animals here. And I know that not everyone in this Zoom chat knows that. You've all grown up with different ways of animals, but there's still a pervasive line, what has been referred to as Adam's wall, that divides humans on one side and animals on the other. And this work seeks to deconstruct that dualism. The social significance, I'd love to just create a new way to live on this planet. Even the most sustainable ones that we have are not mutually beneficent. We've not reached that human line of actually making the world healthier as we live on it. And some of you may each know your own pockets of where people are actually doing that, but I would say the net cost of human life in modern techno-industrial society is not a mutual gain for the rest of the living beings on this planet. And also to set up non-traumatogenic and pathogenic systems. So what that would be a salutogenic system. So what would it look like to have a school that did not cause more harm to people, have hospitals that people did not come out more traumatized from being a participant in, having systems of law enforcement and worldwide control that actually generate health in people, having zoos not be this thing that actually damaged animals, but instead have them being sanctuaries, places where humans and animals could heal each other and learn to live in mutual reciprocity. And also just to reduce the intergenerational transmission trauma, which is a big part of what we'll get into. And for myself, I work with young people. I do wilderness work, I teach psychology, and this year I'm taking on a college preparatory program to help young people gain new opportunities and demand a liberatory education. an education that is not complicit with any sort of system of oppression. And for that, we need an entire new generation of humans. And I hope that this work in ending cultural captivity can bring about that new generation of humans. So this dissertation uses a comparative hermeneutic to explore the concept of collective pathology predicated on the loss of ecological participation across species. Both ecotherapy and applied animal enrichment, which is the therapy we use in zoo animals to mitigate those symptoms, explore how to mitigate the symptoms brought on by the loss of ecological participation with their respective populations. In order to treat the resulting symptoms, sorry, I'm just getting my timer going here. In order to treat the resulting symptoms, both fields are concerned with developing activities or praxis that reconnect an organism with its ancestral ecological energetic exchanges. Yet to date, there's been very little dialogue between these two fields. Zoo animals have been physically captivated and forced into estrangement from their evolved ecology, whereas modern humans, whether coerced or if they've selected it themselves, have also left that context of our ancestral ecology. In comparing and contrasting our current state of disconnection with the plight of zoo animals in captivity, this study seeks to explore the shared nature of psychological suffering due to the loss of ecological participation. I argue that the symptoms that ecotherapists are busy crafting therapies for in the treatment of humans share the same underlying cause as what is being treated by enrichment programs in zoos. That is, the collective symptoms, or pathology if you prefer, is analogous across those two populations. Zoochosis, as stated earlier, is a speciesist term used to describe the collection of symptoms characterized by abnormal, repetitive, and often self-harming behaviors in animals held captive. Given that these collective symptoms exist across a vast array of species as a corollary of disconnection and confinement, I argue through this trans-species hermeneutic that modern humans are suffering from the same condition as a result of our anti-ecological lifestyle, a collective form of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Furthermore, given that these symptoms are only present amongst captive animals, I argue that our modern way of life has become a form of cultural captivity, impacting us in much the same way that physical captivity affects zoo animals. Through a re-engagement of sensory participation with place, and direct action in the here and now, this cultural captivity can be healed. This is the direction that ecotherapy must take if it is to become a liberatory initiative as opposed to a palliative one. Thus, the main research questions in this investigation are: what is the cultural pathology of modern techno-industrial society identified by ecopsychology, predicated on the loss of ecological participation? And how best can we treat it? I contend that applied ecopsychology and environmental enrichment are treating the same issue across species, specifically the loss of ecological participation, known as zoochosis. This is a theoretical hermeneutic study. The lenses that I use, you can see there on the right of the screen. I will be interpreting texts through the lenses of ecopsychology, ethology, trans-species psychology, somatic experiencing, and the neuroaffective relational model, which is a developmental trauma version of somatic experiencing. So because we're looking at this collective pathology, the existing research contained in these texts and all these things will be used for, to enhance the theoretical understanding of each of these and improve their ability to turn theory into practice. Ecotherapy, as applied ecopsychology, is concerned with the healing relationship or connection between humans and the living biosphere. Environmental enrichment has also studied the same thing, trying to mitigate the same symptoms, but in zoo animals. These fields identify a variety of symptoms that are linked to this disconnection and use restorative techniques or therapies to heal them. This dissertation thus explores the collective pathologies each field is treating, their underlying causes, and their therapeutic practices used in treatment. Parallels drawn between the collective pathologies will allow for a new dialogue or praxis to be exchanged across species lines, increasing the efficacy of treating the underlying cause of the loss of ecological participation, afflicting beings across both human and non-human animals. Specifically, I use a comparative hermeneutic to bring the fields of ecopsychology and those studying the impacts of captivity non-human animals into conversation with the aim of mutual illumination. The objective of this study must not be to co-opt one field in service of the other, but rather to mutually benefit two distinct yet deeply connected fields of study. So where I begin the investigation is trying to trace this collective pathology back from ecopsychology. So the modern diagnoses that were leveled in the late 90s and early 2000s by ecopsychologists are on the right there. Some of them focused on our need to consume or our addiction to materialism. Some of them focused on sensory disorders, perceptual disorders that made it so that we couldn't fully participate in the world. A placelessness that made us become radical, and a developmental fixation, which many people are probably familiar with the concept of nature deficit disorder. That would fit into the developmental fixation and some of the attachment relationships that are involved with the collective diagnoses leveled by ecopsychology. And then I add mine, cultural captivity, which I will unpack shortly. But tracing it back, where did this conception, where did this kind of collection of symptoms that seem like very different, how do they connect back? So Theodore Roszak and The Voice of the Earth helped to like really publicize ecopsychology and try to indict modern mainstream positivistic psychology. Paul Shepard, seen as one of the first ecopsychologists, was kind of a, what do I call that, romantic perennialism. But really, he was really about going back to the land, and there was one way to live. And if we don't go back to living in our Pleistocenic personhood, we will never become healthy. Desmond Morris is kind of an unfortunate, creepy uncle, to this study. He took a lot of zoological understandings and biological understandings of animals that were kind of problematic to begin with, and then overlaid them onto people, and unpacked a lot of 1950s homophobia and sexism onto people from that standpoint. Erich Fromm famously brought up the concept of consensual validation has no bearing on sanity. That's just because a million people suffer from the same pathology does not make them sane. And that really plays out here. Sigmund Freud, at the end of his writings, began to point towards entire cities or civilizations developing neuroses, but kind of shied away from actually saying it publicly. And William James offered us a certain kind of blindness that limited the ability of humans to participate fully with the world. So I'm going to do my best to kind of take us through the arcs of the chapters in brief, because there's a lot here to unpack, and I want to make sure that I have time to offer you the conclusions and answer questions. But I've put the lenses at the top of each of these slides. So we begin by reading ecopsychology's cultural pathology through the lens of zoochosis. So to give you kind of help in brief develop that lens for you. Pardon, there's some dog business happening in the background. So all animals and humans come into being through a co-evolutionary dance with place. The pressures and survival, the survival pressures happening, right? It's really distracting. The survival pressures demand a certain type of body morphology to evolve, a certain set of behaviors to develop. And these behaviors thus work to link the animal or human into its place. These behaviors develop, they're called a species-specific behavioral repertoire or species-typical behaviors. And these behaviors become just as fixed, is the theory, as body morphology does. So an elephant has the shape that it has because it helped it stitch it back into its ecosystem. And the behaviors that go with those body morphologies are also ingrained to stitch it back into the world, make it part of a thing. When animals are captivated and brought into a zoo, the context for with them to create that energetic exchange no longer exists. And yet the longing, the drive to participate with that ecosystem is still there. So a void is created in their ability to complete that cycle. And in that void, abnormal, repetitive, self-harming behaviors develop called stereotypies. And this is essentially the foundation for this theory around zoochosis. What I found in this study was that the theory, the languaging, and therapeutic practices, as well as the symptoms, were analogous across what ecopsychology has been identifying, as well as what animal welfare specialists and ethologists were developing around zoochosis. These symptoms only exist in captivity, which begs the question, what is the nature of our captivity if we have the same symptoms and we have the same theories and we have the same healing practices that are bringing us back from the void. And then shift to look at zoochosis, at this concept developed by ethology, through the lens of transpecies psychology, right? And I think first it's just important to unpack here that like ethology and psychology are very different things. They travel down different roads. And ethology was created specifically for animals because of what they lacked, right? Which was this concept that they lacked psyche, they lacked soul, they lacked mentation and cognition, which just isn't true at all, like not even a little bit. Or analogous neural substrates, and we've like, psychologists have evidenced all sorts of behaviors through mentation, memory, cognition, like love, attachment, all the way like through crocodiles, octopus, everything. So like it's kind of the idea of zoochosis in this ethological needs model is predicated on a vestige that doesn't actually hold up as an appropriate lens to look at human behavior or even animal behavior. So, and when we use transpecies psychology to look at zoochosis, there are analogous diagnoses for countless disorders or collections of symptoms if we want to stay away from pathologizing anything. And zoochosis is no different. And zoochosis does exist as an analogous diagnosis for humans who have been captivated in the same way, like prisoners of war. And that's complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which differs from post-traumatic stress disorder in that it is the repeated protracted traumatizations or even developmental trauma like little t that only happen when something can't escape, when it is held captive. Then take this understanding of, now that we're talking about trauma, and I look at it through somatic experiencing, because somatic experiencing was actually developed through observations of animals and taken to work with humans, and has been very successful at reframing what trauma is and working with people. So to bring us up to speed, there's the collective pathology of ecopsychology, which is analogous with zoochosis. Zoochosis is analogous with CPTSD, and now CPTSD, if we look at it through somatic experiencing, is something called chronic tonic immobility, which is the freeze response from the fight, flight, freeze response you may be familiar with. Universal defense-orienting response that is not allowed to continue to process. So an animal may, when escape is not available, go into this freeze state. The theory is, at least from Levine, that it will prevent the animal from feeling the pain of being eaten alive, or perhaps present a second chance of escape if the predator thinks it has died. This is a natural cycle that one should be able to cycle in and out of, except because of excessive fear or restraint or convention, humans get stuck in this spot. Specifically, is Levine's theory. And in that way, we get stuck in this tonic immobility state and it becomes chronic. Thus, trauma is not a mental disorder. It is instead an injury to the body or the embodiment of captivity. So now we've got somehow the collective pathology first looked at by ecopsychology has become the embodiment of captivity. But so far we've only looked at like physical captivity, animals in zoos, prisoners of war, or the captivity of a parasympathetic nervous system response from somatic experiencing. So in this next chapter, I take this conception of trauma offered by somatic experiencing and look at it through the neuroaffective relational model, which takes somatic experiencing's theory and drops it into developmental trauma. Because we've only been looking at physical captivity at this point. In order to overlay a form of captivity onto modern society, we have to be able to show that it's also a type of psychological captivity. And in order to do that, I needed to find that it could be generated by seemingly benign events. It could be passed down through lineages intergenerationally, and it could impact large groups or cultures. And in fact, all of those can be evidenced, and all of those are evidenced in this chapter. That's what I was trying to do. And in the second part of chapter 5, what I take is ecopsychology's cultural pathology. And now that I've developed this lens of cultural captivity, I look back at this whole thing to see if we can complete the cycle. What we find is that traumatic genetic norms perpetuate and pass this down through lineages. And some great examples are Joy DeGroy's post-traumatic slave syndrome, Chellis Glendenning's Hello, My Name is Chellis, and then Rayner does some amazing work on ecological trauma. And the two symptoms that emerge when we do this overlay of cultural captivity back onto ecopsychology are the inability to sensorially attune and take direct action in the here and now, which are the two symptoms that also emerge from both Levine's somatic experiencing as the symptoms of PTSD, and again from the neuroaffective relational model as the symptoms that emerge from complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So the two main symptoms identified by ecopsychologists for our cultural pathology, again, line up with this form of collective trauma. Now, taking it out of the personal and the individual's body and taking it out into like living in a system, I wanted to make sure we honor traditional ecological knowledge here, it's a form of native science that again points to these two things: this ability to sensorially attune to the world around us and take direct action in the here and now as informed by that information. And this is the way to live it forward. So instead of trying to go back to some sort of Pleistocenic time or ask the world to live in teepees, which is super not cool and appropriative, even if you don't think so, it's a mode of engaging with the world. It's a way of listening through the body that both Cohen and Abram offer as ecotherapies in this tradition. But I want to make sure that there's credit given for this older system of how to live on the land from a cultural perspective. So looking at the deficits created by cultural captivity and different types of trauma, but I'll just go back real quick, the developmental, intergenerational, and collective forms of this. And then looking at the dramaturgic norms, the need to sensorially attune in the here and now, and then incorporating parts of traditional ecological knowledge. I offer what I call a place-based sensory participation that brings those all together as a way to unlock the cage of cultural captivity. And that's what I'm going to offer you now to make sure we understand both of those things. So the main arguments that I came to, the main findings, right? We sought to illuminate the contours of ecopsychology's collective pathology by exploring its existence across human and non-human animals. Following the trail of this collective pathology revealed that analogous symptoms, theory, and healing practices to those evidenced by ecopsychology exist across both human and non-human animals in the context of this loss of ecological participation. Furthermore, this constellation of symptoms affecting both modern humans and captive animals is consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder and is generated by both physical and psychological forms of captivity. And finally, the collective pathology of the modern world is a collective form of developmental trauma, transmitted intergenerationally through traumatogenic norms, and is the natural and predictable response to the conditions of cultural captivity. Cultural captivity in itself, right, combines the findings from developmental trauma, intergenerational trauma, and collective historical trauma. It highlights the environmental failures, psychological foreclosure, and the somatic imprisonment inherent in this condition and shared across species lines in both human and non-human animals. Cultural captivity is constructed through the cultural and intergenerational transmission of maladaptive biological survival and defense strategies. Cultural captivity is further compounded by the consensual validation of these strategies as normal and healthy, allowing for the perpetuation of this collective intergenerational form of developmental trauma to continue. In response towards this unwilding of needed to combat cultural captivity and remember the human, bring it back to the world, I propose a type of place-based sensory participation. Earlier, I'd mentioned the concept of a species-specific behavioral repertoire. The behaviors that are thought to have been ingrained over evolutionary time and connect human and non-human animals to their ancestral bioregions. The ethological needs model suggests that when these behaviors are thwarted, the symptoms of zoochosis emerge. However, the concept of species-typical behaviors most associated with zoochosis and enrichment programs was found to be reliant on an outdated understanding of genetic determinism. So instead of thwarting of a universal defense response in situations of protracted restraint and fear generate the symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, what is lost is the ability to sensorially attune to place in the here and now. And incorporating concepts from transspecies psychology, ecopsychology, somatic experiencing, and traditional ecological knowledge, I propose this place-based sensory participation. Concept recognizes the coevolutionary development of human and non-human animals with place and incorporates sensory-based participation in the here and now across species. This concept also shifts the focus of genetically determined models of behavior away from a set of programmed behaviors necessary for optimal wellness to an emphasis on the need to use our sensing bodies to garner place-specific information. Thus, both ecotherapies and environmental enrichment programs oriented around place-based sensory participation will recognize the species common model of the collective traumatization imposed by captive systems. They will work to reestablish the species typical sensory connections that can help to resolve the thwarted defense orienting response offered by somatic experiencing. Lastly, they will let the land and the others teach the survivors of cultural captivity to use their sensory attunement to develop new ways of living as mutually enhancing members of a bioregion. To the extent that an environment numbs, overwhelms, discombobulates, or misaligns to our sensing bodies, they will be internalized as threats. These wild, disconnected environments create neurophysiological pathways and associated maladaptive norms. To remain in participation with these ungrounded and anti-ecological abstractions is to ignore our ability to garner place-based information and use it to create reciprocal vitality with the land. In order to overcome the numbing and sensory distortion, cultural captivity, place-based sensory participation prioritizes cultivating, caretaking healthy ecological relationships informed by sensory information in the immediate moment. I'll return to some outcomes and recommendations for both ecopsychology and ecotherapy. We are dealing with a collective issue here. This is not a personal pathology. We're not working to help with one person's depression and bring them back to a normative baseline so they can continue to participate in a system that generated the cultural captivity that it's actually connected to their depression. And also just, I love ecopsychology, but genetic determinism is super problematic and is not taking us in the right direction and actually connects us to this fallacy connected to the ecological needs model, which there's just nothing down that road. And ecotherapy just needs to be, I would say, just needs to be mindful of palliative efforts versus liberatory efforts. There's a utilitarian argument that perpetuates captivity of zoo animals. The more effective an environmental enrichment program is at reducing suffering, it actually increases the likelihood that that animal will stay in captivity by taking away its suffering. The animal is no longer suffering. There's no longer a reason to get them out of captivity, as the argument goes. So ecotherapies that reduce suffering but like maintain the system that was creating the suffering are kind of just creating a closed loop that will never end. And level 1 and level 2 ecotherapies. Level 1 ecotherapies are those that just treat human pathologies or symptoms using nature as a tool, whereas level 2 ecotherapies seek to create mutually healing relationships with the land. And I think that level 1, it can exist, but only as a way to get those of us that are hurting and not able to really find those reciprocal relationships yet, get to that spot. But if we're just returning people to a baseline that they can then participate in creating systems of oppression and trauma, it's just not worth it. Some of the areas that I've identified for future work with place-based sensory participation are sanctuary systems for zoos. There's some great systems of how we can, again, turn these into non-traumatogenic areas. I do have a dream that the world will gift me both the National Zoo and the San Diego Zoo someday, and I will turn them into sanctuaries, and we will do amazing cultural captivity work there. In the meantime, deep nature connection practices that I do with children that help them really learn to tune their senses and tune them to not to human-made constructions, but take them out to the place and let them learn birdsong and let them start to develop those abilities to learn and listen to the land and the others. MoveNet is also another place that is based, it's almost like a human movement environmental enrichment that takes the way that the body evolved and the activities, the functional movements it would have been used to do in the Pleistocene. I think it's just a really interesting sensory way of engaging place. So instead of stationary exercises in a built home, like many of us are doing these days. It's a way of actually going to a new place and letting the place tell you how you will move through it. I think that's just an amazing way to develop the skill in place-based sensory participation. Wilderness skills also give the resiliency and the ability to read the book of nature and engage it at a higher skill level. And permaculture in itself is just set up to listen to the land and be informed by the land and told how to live on it, and not to impose an abstraction of a human-made farming system, but to instead use principles to let the land actually instruct us how to make it more vital, so that humans can actually come back to this earth. I would say that a human is someone who makes the land more vital by living on it, and I haven't seen that in a little while. So for myself, what I gained out of this, this is how as a teacher I set it up with the kids when we have what we call reality checks. Like, what did you used to think and what do you think now? And I did not believe any of my professors when they told me this was going to be a transformative experience. I was really convinced I'd already found what I was looking for. And then I met G.A. Bradshaw and that all fell apart. But what I used to think was that we did need to go back to a Paul Shepherd world, to a world of hunter-gatherers, and that was the only way that health could exist for a human. And now I understand that there's a way of moving forward that involves deep listening and this sensory attunement. I used to believe I was searching for a species-specific behavioral repertoire for the human, and if I could find that, I could help us all. And now what I'm understanding is there's a mode of listening, there's a mode of being with the land and the others that can actually teach us who to be in each place. There is no way for us to be universally. There's a way that each bioregion will call its humans into being. And I believe that I was complicit, that every act I did with my life was complicit in the death of the living world, and it was crushing me. And that's a large part of why I took on this project, was that I was at the effect of cultural captivity and couldn't find a way out. And through it, and engaging it as a liberatory activity and engaging young people for the last 6 years and helping them develop these skills, I found a lot more agency in it, and that's been hugely transformative. And to that end, I used to think we needed to take down the entire cage before we could have any sort of health. And as I've watched young people build connections with each other and with the land and with myself, I've watched hearts come back online. And I do believe that there's something much deeper in just the nature connection of human to human that I'm sure we're all missing right now in this strange season of the world. But I do think that first step is finding the nature connect that we can have with each other and building that up. And then for me, just a brief moment of gratitude just to my committee for the support, reflections, challenges, and excitement they brought to every conversation, and to my family and friends who held space for me while I took on this seemingly bizarre journey to many of them, and to Scott Bowman for coaching me through the bulk of the writing, and for Faye Johnson to bring in the spark and helping me finish this project. I appreciate you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excellent. All right. So I think this is a CIIS custom, but at any rate, it's an East-West psychology custom. At this point, I would like to ask the external member of the committee to go first in asking any questions that she has for our candidate.
Is that me?
Yeah, that's you.
That was beautiful. Beautiful, Vaughan. In your skill, you had a list of the types of things that you're working on with the children and steps forward. Are you including, or how is including what I would call nature has effaced? In other words, decentering human-human, or say deprivileging human-human relationships, and perhaps raising the agency and privilege of non-humans. I don't know. In other words, is there a component that moves us out of our humanness, our exclusivity, or maybe a wonderful way to say it is, how would you describe connecting with nature in a personal way, where the tree that's standing in front of you or the deer that's standing in front of you is a real person, you know, just like we would consider a human.
Mhm. I would say there's a couple parts to that in the work that I do with the kids. I think that I take a lot of Michael Cohen's Reconnecting with Nature work, which is taking away the thinking mind and taking away the names of things, taking away the labels and the taxonomy of things and the human-made constructions and identities that we've imposed onto things, and allowing our sensing bodies to try to gain consent and move towards or away from, and just sensing that attraction. And there are moments where I'll watch a student feel really attracted by a rose bush and then notice something and need to move away from it. And if they keep following this kind of sensing body movement, following attraction to attraction to attraction, I find that it's been very helpful to them in that way. And one of my favorite activities is, or one of my favorite learnings in this project was I wanted us to, I so wanted cultural captivity to end so that I could see the people of the water. What does a human look like that was evolved to live in water? Like what does a human look like that was evolved to live in the sky? And I realized that I had been so off on it. And that's one of the conversations that we have with the kids a lot, is just like, no, there are the people of the sky. You know, we call them birds. They're all the people of the ocean, right? And there are the people of the ground. So just seeing that, I think just the word human kind of can get confusing sometimes. And if we realize that there's personhood in people of all shapes and sizes, that humans aren't the only people, we can get a lot further with our young people.
Are the children understanding individual animals or trees or bushes that they encounter as individuals, you know, with an arc in their life and a history, a biography?
You know, I'm not sure if they've fully gotten that far. I think like that's something that we can definitely check in on. I try to do these feedback surveys to make sure that sometimes what I think I'm teaching, they're getting something different often. So that would definitely be something for me to check in on with them.
So that the non-humans are actors and take on agency, and the humans are more respondent in that way, listening in that way to the voices.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
So Zain, do you have questions?
Sure. So I think one thing that strikes me, Vaughan, is how clear your presentation is and how much you've struggled to get there. And I can imagine that people watching this, it might sort of almost like reinforce the idea that like, what have you been doing with yourself? And I think maybe some of the people on your committee have had a slightly more intimate journey with you in that. And I'm struck by how around spring, you still had a lot of confusion going on, and you have turned a lot of it around. And I can speak to that in a moment, but I'm just I would just love to hear you speak to the process, right? Like how did this very theoretical exercise bring you to action in the moment?
I think that there was a point somewhere in the process where I learned that the job, right, the ask of an academic is to identify your worldview publicly and then have it shredded to bits and have to build from the ground up again. And I think I was still clinging and didn't want it, or wasn't ready to call it in. And then I will say that trying to teach full time and only write in the summers was a challenge, but it was a commitment that I wanted to make to young people. And so what turned it into action? Oh, wow, that's kind of funny. Yeah, the spring's been really interesting. It's nothing like turning up all your magic for years and then spend 6 years meditating on captivity and then watching the entire world manifest into a state of captivity. I got to be more careful with my magic, Zain. So I think that call me to action was just that love and connection with people and finding my spark and finding people that filled me up and just being ready for play at a different level. I think I'm just ready for a different level of me, and that's more the personal transformation. But you know, not having to experience 4-hour commutes and sit in traffic and stand under fluorescent lights every day, and actually getting more sleep and eating good foods and doing all the things that I would say are part of a healthy lifestyle that are precluded by a lot of what is normative in our society, which I imagine you're experiencing a lot more doing the robotic stuff, right? So it's like,
Sure.
yeah, I just think some of that ease and getting back to like what I might say are like Linda Bazell or Paul Shepard-esque kind of time cycles were really helpful to me.
Yeah. And then it also occurs to me just the way in which you have sort of owned your voice. I would say a little bit earlier, you really were dancing around the idea of putting forward like this place-based sensory participation. And I would say even in the dissertation itself, you're still dancing around it more than you are right now. And I'm just curious about that. This seems like sort of a powerful sort of movement, right? Of owning your voice and just kind of speaking to like, oh wait, no, I actually have something to do with this and it's going to go somewhere.
I appreciate that. I think that's, I want to say deficit mindset. I would just say that it's always been easier for me to look at what's wrong than to look at what's right. And I spent a lot of my time focusing on identifying the captivity, and it took some personal changes to be able to start to look for the light of the place-based sensory participation, and I suppose to live into it and own it more. So thank you for noticing that.
Yeah. And I guess I have just one more question that's fascinating to me is pushing the idea of participation a little bit. Gay mentioned decentering the human, and I was thinking the way you said about like really honoring this deep listening. And I'm sort of curious in multiple ways, right? So your place-based sensory participation. So what does like concrete or steel or like the internet think about your plan, right? Like, I mean, if we're gonna be honest with our place-based sensory participation, there's other people in the room that maybe aren't the people that we like to sort of romantically think about. And so I'm really curious about what those people think. And I'm also sort of curious about, yeah, you know, like this is my work, right? My work is around this sort of imagining participation in a lot of ways. And I'm just like, wow, what are the possibilities of participation beyond like plants and animals, which I think is profoundly important. But how do we take honestly the fact that steel is in the game?
Yeah, that's real. I mean, Abram's got some great stuff about, David Abram has some great stuff about almost like the shapes of it, like the human constructions kind of like dumb or change the voices or alter the almost the frequency that like steel and stone are speaking to us when they're seen in buildings. But I also know there's everything happening with new materialism and the vibrant matter folks. And I imagine that plays into this in a way that I haven't fully gotten into. I will say that like there's the other side of it with like Cohen and some other folks that talk about just the symbolic and semantic load of a human imprint on something, so that when there may still be the same like stone or steel beings that we can connect with in this participatory way, but speaking them through the semantic and symbolic load of like human abstractions, almost like if everyone in modern society is suffering from a collective form of trauma, then every manifestation of that psyche bears with it some of that stamp. So I just wonder what kind of like clouding or distortion that would offer to that participation. But that's, I think, you know, that's the sequel maybe.
Yeah. Well, and I think my interest is even maybe a little deeper is like how has concrete played in a role? How's corn played it? Like what are the codependent relationships, right? Like if we're really decentering humans, you know, like corn got to be corn syrup, and like it's having a good time too, right? Like it's not just humans. And so that's where I'm fascinated to sort of push your place-based sensory participation in those ways.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna have to connect more with you on that. That's I hadn't gotten to corn syrup in my thinking, so that's something I gotta get there.
But I just want to say, I'm super like awesome job. And man, you really, I mean, you did a lot here. And so that's why I started with my first question is I don't know how much people can actually see that because it is so clear at this moment. And so I guess I'm just speaking for all those really hard, crazy moments in between here and there. So you totally stepped into this as an initiation. Yeah, more power to you, man.
Thank you so much.
Can I ask a question in between?
Yeah, sure.
It was, sorry to interrupt. You said that, with the pandemic, we're in captivity. But really, is it that kind of captivity in the same kind of way, in the sense of it's very liberatory, in the sense of breaking the mechanisms and the institutions, obviously a lot of suffering going on, but in the sense of it is disabling a lot of the mechanisms, both mental as well as physical, which you've talked about in terms of breaking down the captive culture.
Yeah, I had this conversation with some friends that had told me that like the world needs this book about captivity right now, and I was like, I'm not talking about that kind of captivity. Like it's something different. Like I'm speaking from a place of like extreme privilege. I have been having a very different experience in this pandemic than a lot of the families that I work with and the children that I work with. I got to keep most of my money. I had a summer vacation. I got to travel around the country with social distance camping and not seeing anyone, just participating with different places. I have just like beautiful people in my life, and the systems that were breaking me down and stressing me out and keeping me from sleeping and keeping me from being healthy were disrupted. But there is a polarization where some people are getting it easier now and some people are getting it way harder. So I think that disruption and just acknowledging the privilege and the lack of equity in that, hopefully in all the ways that the world is showing up with the inequity right now, are things that we can take notice of and shift. But it's not the same for everyone. And I'm definitely not experiencing Corona as a form of captivity personally though.
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and ask a question. I had a couple, but you answered them. So Vaughan, before I ask, I wanted to just mention that, and my colleagues have touched on this a bit too, that I appreciate so much the clarity and the organization of what you presented, and also the integrity of it. I saw that right from, well, I was going to say from the beginning of the process, but it was really true of you when you were still coming to class. I see what you're doing as intellectually informed, but it's also very heart-based. And there's an ethic of care that inhabits your work in a really deep way that I think is also personal. So I wanted to praise that because we need it. I also wanted to mention that I've appreciated, and Zain mentioned this, your openness to changing your attitude as the work started working on you. And the willingness to be in it, even though it breaks apart things that you might prefer or used to prefer perhaps to hold on to, but have since gotten rid of, So my question is, I'm imagining somebody maybe outside academia, let's do it that way, who hears about your work, because my fantasy is that you're going to now be doing workshops and writing books in addition to creating programs. So
call it in, Craig, call it in.
And those zoos are going to show up and say, turn us into sanctuaries. So in the midst of all that, so I'm imagining this person who shows up and says, I've been exposed to your work and I appreciate it, but I don't feel like a captive. I don't see the prison that you say that I'm in. So, because that's a response that's going to come up sooner or later, right? And there's variations of that. Things like people go, well, I like being in the heart of the city. I like being downtown. I like living downtown. I don't go out in nature, So I'm just curious, what would your response or maybe your approach be to somebody who presents with that, either verbally or in writing or what have you,
Yeah, well, I've been getting a lot more practice at that in the season of the world with, taking on the white problem of white insecurity.
Yep.
and trying to address it with other folks that identify like me. And there's a lot of people who don't see that. And those are the conversations to not shy away from. So in the same way, I think that that same kind of like sense of privilege, I'm sure is going to enact itself on this work, because it is kind of, for me, it was always like at 359 degrees, it's invisible. And then at that 360th, you can see it. So I think there's this search to find that for different people. And I don't want to center this on like, I don't want to center the work on trying to make people feel good about their lives, because there is the double-edged sword of the way we're living on this planet is killing it, right? And is causing like untold others to go extinct. And to say that I feel fine, I don't care about that's in the same way of being like, you know what, trying to like unpack my own implicit like white supremacy is not something I want to engage in either. It's untenable, and it's not part of what's available in the season of the world right now. So I think that there are going to be some fun invitational ways that I can bring this up, like with the wilderness skills and kind of appealing to people's want for being able to be more capable out in the woods and take their kids out themselves and engage them that way and try to show them the joy. There's that Buckminster Fuller quote that I'm going to not get right, but it's, you don't need to tear down the system, you just need to throw a really good party. And I think that that's part of it, is being able to not focus on the negative and try to make people see how they're hurting, but maybe just throw a really good party and bring some of that love and that joy with integrity and I don't know, academics into it.
Thank you. That makes sense to me. I'm reminded of something Stephen Harding says. He's a colleague who actually more or less directs Schumacher College, or he did in the past. I don't know what his current position is, but when he speaks about things like things that are related to the cage, you know, for instance, climate change, with British humor, but also dead seriousness, he often says to people in public, if you're not upset about what's happening, you need to get into therapy and work out why you're not upset, you know? So that, you know, that's part of it. But I like what you bring as far as addressing the other part, which is the need to not only look at what's going wrong, but where can we go that's right, and where can we go that feels okay, and to support that part of it too, you know? Yeah,
I mean, in Cohen's work, Michael J. Cohen, it's all over the place when you read it. He doesn't cite many people. He says he created all on his own, which is problematic in its own way. Yeah, the actual exercises that are all just about focusing on what lights up your body and what your body needs, all about calibrating your system and your senses, I think is an interesting invitation and entry point for many people to focus on, fly towards the light, not the darkness.
Good, great. So if the committee doesn't have any further questions, then I think this might be the time for the committee the two of you to go ahead and call me like we talked about previously, and then we can have our conference call. So go ahead, just speaking to the committee, go ahead and turn off your video and mute yourself. And then for everybody else who's on this Zoom call, this is a chance to ask the candidates some questions and put Vaughan even more on the spot than he's been already. So while the committee convenes, feel free to go ahead and just unmute yourselves and ask away. He's right here. So we will be back in a few minutes.
Hi, friends.
I have a question, Vaughan.
I'd love to answer it for you if I can.
Well, it's actually something I was thinking about when you were talking. I made some notes about intergenerational trauma and the defense mechanisms. So I read an article not too long ago, this is the biologist in me, that was talking about epigenetics and emotional trauma of the parents actually affecting the biology of their offspring, which is super cool to think about. That, you know, I don't know if you've read much about epigenetics and how trauma can actually impact the physical aspects of generations later. So if that's happening, how do we deal with that? So in other words, we have children who don't even realize that trauma of their parents is affecting their current state.
Yeah, you're right on it. Yeah, so like a bunch of chapter 5 in my thing is all about that, about how it's transmitted that way. And I focus on the attachment relationship because that's like one of the most like implicit and insidious forms of developmental trauma is just say like a parent did not receive appropriate or well-attuned care as a child. Those oxytocin pathways that would actually enable that parent to then be able to respond to their child's need and give proper attunement to that child never develop. So it's actually a physiological inability that would have to be behaviorally modified to be able to like kind of do oxytocin push-ups that would allow for that parenting to occur. And they now have clinics that will help develop that pathway in your child if you were not able to fully get there and teach you the behaviors to get there in that way. A great resource for that is by Alexander. It's called Intergenerational Cycles of Trauma and Abuse, I think. And also there's one called by Wotan, I think is his name, and it's It Didn't Start With You. And that one really goes into the epigenetics of it and kind of brings in the concept of 7 generations, whereas you're in the middle and the 3 generations before you impact your physiology from an intergenerational trauma standpoint, and you will interact the next 3 generations. And he kind of goes into, I think it's mostly been experimented with like mice in terms of at the cellular level,
Yeah.
but they were, it's also, there's studies with mothers from 9/11 showing that those who were diagnosed with PTSD from that event and gave birth in the wake of it, their children all had a higher proclivity towards post-traumatic stress as a result. And Wotan takes it a step further and says that in your grandmother, while your grandmother was pregnant, the precursor cells in your mother that would one day become you already exists, so that the trauma that exists in your grandmother while she's pregnant with your mother will actually visit physiological changes on you that you will then pass down to your children. And on the male side, because sperm cycles through so quickly, if a thing had happened to grandpa that day, that could also find its way in. It's just like the different cycles. It's more acute with sperm and more pronounced and prolonged with ovum.
And really quickly, you said it was called It Didn't Start With You. I want to.
It Didn't Start With You is the one,
okay.
I think Wotan, like W-O-T-T-O-N is the name. I might have that wrong, but pretty sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so.
Awesome job.
Oh, thanks. Anybody else have any questions?
Thank you so much, Vaughan. This is an amazing and compelling work. I can't wait to read it.
Oh, hey, Kevin, thank you.
Yeah, I'm about to start my dissertation process. I'm working on the proposal, and it's related to cultivating the spiritual heart. And one of the questions I've been asking, I live in Oakland in the Bay Area, and one of the questions I've been asking myself is where would be a nurturing and supportive place for me to plant myself to do this work, to do this exploration. And it's an embodied exploration. And, you know, the question, I guess it's sort of, I'm not sure what my question is, but I feel a longing to plant myself in a place that is saturated in a more natural environment. And so I guess it's sort of related to Zain's question about concrete, and like how do we begin to practice this place-based sensory participation in an urban environment? You know, I mean, I can walk to a neighborhood park, but it's still, you know, I'm walking to it in this midst of cars going by and, you know, lots of noise. And even in the place that I'm going to, you know, it's surrounded by, you know, buildings and people, and it's like this little small space. So how do you see, and when I think about it in a meta frame with 7 billion people on the planet, you know, we all, and I know, I heard that you saying it's not about going back. So how do we move forward given what we have now, you know, given that many people don't even, as you pointed out, don't even have the option or an easy option to get to a place that is much more nature saturated, untouched by human.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know that we've ever had many places untouched by humans. That's like the first part I'll jump in. There's people everywhere and always were. That's just one of those weird hierarchical history bits. But I would say that I had in this writing, I went to this beautiful farm in Canada, and it was not actually the thing for me. So that was this weird kind of coming up against, wait, I said if I was in this place, this would do this for me. And then now I live in Oakland, I have this little backyard, and that's actually this beautiful place. And I think it's about the level of engagement for me and the participation with those things. Like I have this garden, and I know every plant in there, and I get to care for them. And it's about that participation. It's less of an engagement, like there is a world around me doing a thing to me, whereas it's like there are beings that I can hang out with back here and be with in their own way. So I found that. I know that many ecotherapists would say that you can simulate sounds, and I'm not convinced that like the simulations really work. I think it's, to me, something more about the participating with another and being told how to engage with it. So for me, just learning what can grow where and having to be taught by the land, like just in my little backyard patch, how that works, that's been really helpful for me. But in terms of like finding a new place to plant, I'm thinking what came to mind when you said that was like parapsychology and the soul of place, and how every little bioregion has its own soul that enacts itself on and through humans. And that's like one of Craig's specialties that I incorporate a little bit in terms of place in this work. But the idea that I lived in the outer Richmond and I could just feel the wind across sand dunes like through it, and I like couldn't write out there. And I found more places. There's some people that need to write on bedrock. There's all the different places. So I just wonder what an engagement of like the history of your little place would be, and knowing more about what the psyche of place might be trying to work out through you, and if it's actually in service of your dissertation and like cultivating a spiritual heart, or if it's pointed towards a different season, and maybe there's a different energy you could call in.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, good timing.
Hey, friends.
I want to make sure everybody's back here. All right. So it is the opinion of your dissertation committee that you have passed your dissertation defense. So it's my pleasure to be able to be the very first person to refer to you as Dr. Wilkins. Congratulations. Awesome work. Awesome work.
That feels good. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So your next assignment is to party. And I hope you will.
COVID party.
Yeah. Yeah. Social distance party or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess this would be an awkward moment to ask, but it's a natural question. How do you feel?
How do I feel? I'm feeling like the absence of a thing right now, like a weight, an angst to drive, you know, a 20-year kind of push towards a thing, a 13-year like scream to have somebody understand what I was talking about, just kind of dissipate into the, well, shoot, well, what are we going to do tomorrow? So possibilities are endless. Gonna call it in, start working on the next thing. Let's save all the kids, and let's like end all the cultural captivity.
Well, oh, go ahead.
Can I interrupt and just say it first? Dr. Vaughan Wilkins.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really touched. I unfortunately couldn't see the first part because I was in another Zoom meeting, but I will watch what I missed because I feel like I missed a lot. But congratulations. It's great to see you doing what you've been doing, what you dreamed of, and manifested it so beautifully. Like, I love what you said, Craig, about the ethics of care and heart work, because that was my experience of you as a student in the program. So congratulations, Dr. Wilkins.
Yeah, thank you. This wouldn't have happened without you. You're the first person I said this to that didn't tell me I was crazy. So that's why I ended up going to school there. So thank you.
Yeah, everyone else is crazy. So yes, Craig said party, but actually I think rest is the first one. Rest and then party.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there's time for all of it. Just call it all in.
Yeah, congratulations again.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your support. And honestly, though, please, all of you, just hold that for me, that someone will gift me the National Zoo and the San Diego Zoo. We've got a lot of work to do for a lot of imprisoned beings. So
We'll stay in touch.
thank you so much.
Congratulations.
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 Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so good to see you. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to jump off and go do a cartwheel.
All
There you
right.
go, man.
Take care, man.
Great job.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.